Welcome to Analytically Delicious, Insights into Food Safety by LVA. Join us as we explore the latest developments, trends, and challenges in ensuring the safety of our food supply through analytical techniques, uncovering the science behind what makes our food safe and delicious.
Hello and welcome back to Analytically Delicious. Today we delve into a cutting-edge area of scientific research, the exposome. But what exactly is the exposome? It refers to the totality of environmental factors that we encounter throughout our lives, from the food we consume to the air we breathe, and how these factors interact with our biology. With new technologies like mass spectrometry and metabolomics, we can now analyze this complex web of exposures in unprecedented detail. To help us unpack this fascinating topic, we are joined by Professor Benedikt Warth, a leading expert in exposomics and food chemistry at the University of Vienna. Benedikt has spent years developing innovative analytical methods to study how environmental exposures affect human health, and today he will shed light on the exposome's impact on disease, epigenetics, and even social inequalities. So what is the exposome and why is it so crucial for understanding our health and the world around us? Join us as we explore the science behind it and its profound implications for food safety, toxicology, and public health. Now grab your headphones and join us for this insightful conversation on Analytically Delicious. Hello Benedikt, it's really nice to have you here today.
Hi David, thanks a lot for inviting me. It's a real pleasure being part of the podcast.
So Benedikt, if you could choose one superpower to help you analyze the exposome better, what would it be?
Well, that's a great question, and I have to be very honest. So that's the only question I prepared. So in the sense of full transparency, I got the question before, and I'm not very much into superhero stories. So I asked the question my kids, and actually I got some great ideas. They have been much more creative than I am. So actually I come up with three. I hope it's okay.
Yeah, sure.
Talk already quite a bit in the beginning, but one of my highlights was that my eyes could become kind of a microscope.
Yeah.
But with molecular resolution, so that I could see single molecules and thousands of molecules at the same time, for example, acting on our body and seeing how they interact with each other. And this interplay would be extremely amazing to watch, I can imagine.
Yeah, for sure.
A second thing would be becoming a specific molecule. Let's say we're in a food safety podcast, right? So though we are covering many topics, but let's assume you are any kind of food contaminant, a pesticide, whatever, and would go on the journey from being in the diet and then ingested, going through the GI tract of the body, being metabolized by the microbiota in the gut, going through the liver, being metabolized, then being excreted, going to the wastewater, down the drain, ending up somewhere in the mature properly from the wastewater treatment plant, then being brought on the field, taken up by a plant, and ending up in food again, and kind of this whole circle, understanding that as a molecule would be pretty cool, I guess.
That sounds
great.
Thinking
about it.
The circle would be closed then at the end. Yeah.
Exactly, and I had the privilege to work in all these different areas during my career so far, from the food safety analytics to human metabolism and toxicology and agriculture. And I have the feeling I have quite a good understanding what's going on the molecular level, but I'm pretty sure there would be many surprises that we cannot grasp right now. Can I add a third?
Sure,
superpower?
The third one is missing, yeah.
Yeah, because that would be the time travel. I think that would also be awesome in both directions. So thinking going back, I guess that we could learn a lot from some of the ancient societies. Let's think about the guys in Egypt, what they did 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, or also the Hebrew high society. If you're looking into the very old books of the Bible, they have great laws how to ensure safety actually for molds, for example, and infections. And I think we could learn a lot from that from a public health perspective. Looking back and looking forth into the future, would be equally amazing, I guess.
Yeah, sure.
When we just think, we are working with mass spectrometry 20 years back when I was a student. The instrumental performance was completely different compared to what we are doing now. So looking 20 years in the future, I expect there's to some extent exponential growth still in some areas. Would be very, very, very awesome already today.
Definitely a very interesting aspect, and I will come to that point a little bit later about the aspects, the future aspects of your work. But for now, I would like to start with a basic question, actually. So today's topic is about the exposome, and I would like to start with a simple question by asking you to explain what the exposome actually is and why it is important for our understanding of human health.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a new term that's around for about 15, 20 years now. But I think now it's really kind of getting a lot of attention because people realize that only looking at our genes did not solve really our chronic health issues. And we are living in an aging society. That's great. So we are very privileged. Our people in our country and also globally are getting older than ever before.
Yeah.
But the problem is that the years of healthy life is already going down in our westernized world. And of course, that's linked to diet, lifestyle choices, and so on. And that's a big problem for our public health system on one hand, but also on an individual level, of course, because every one of us knows someone who's suffering from a chronic condition where we know that the genes are not responsible. So I remember that when I was in high school, our biology teacher told us that once the Human Genome Project will be finished, we know basically all about our genes and how to cure our heavy disease burdens like cancers and so on. Now we know that was not true, and we're just grasping at the surface, and everything's getting far more complicated. These diseases are multifactorial, and we know from genome-wide association studies where we can do full genome sequencing and associating that to certain disease risk, that the main chronic disease that are troubling our society, like neurodegenerative diseases, Alzheimer's, Parkinson, certain cancers and so on, that the contribution of our genome is relatively little, so maybe 10, 20, 30%, and all the environmental factors are about 70 to 90%. And those are summarized in the concept of the exposome. So basically, it's everything that's not our genes. And as a chemist, we are focusing on the chemical exposome, so on everything, all the molecules we can measure, because we know chemicals impact our health for the good or for the bad. I think we're going to talk about that later.
Yeah.
It's not only bad, so chemical exposures can also be very good, actually, and very, very healthy. But kind of measuring that, quantifying it, and doing evidence-based medicine and policy is the idea why we want to look at these chemical exposures that we are facing as human beings from conception until we are dying in a more holistic way.
That sounds extremely interesting, and I have a follow-up question on that. What are the key factors actually that make up an individual's exposome?
Yeah, that depends very much on where you are living, how you are living, and probably the single most important factor is your diet in general. And I'm not saying that because I'm here in a food safety podcast, but and because I'm a food chemist, but because we see that for all different compound classes of toxins, contaminants that we're exposed to, no matter if they are typical environmental pollutants or if they are typical food contaminants, in the end, for most of those compound classes, the largest contribution comes from the food.
Yeah.
And I'm just thinking about a lecture I gave to our students at the University of Vienna yesterday, where we discussed some of these very classical environmental pollutants and also food contaminants, like the polyaromatic hydrocarbons that are known for decades, benzopyrene, highly carcinogenic, You find it in your steak if you're doing barbecue during the summer, in smoked ham and so on. But actually it was there for the last thousands of years. So you had it from wildfires, wherever you have incomplete combustion, they are produced. You can find it in the sediments and so on. But if you're doing kind of the full exposure assessment, looking where those exposures are coming from, the largest contribution typically comes from the food. Although this is a group that's in indoor air, outdoor air. If you're smoking, of course, you are having heavy exposure. But even for occasional smokers, diet would be more important. And it's just one example showing how important the diet is.
Definitely. So we can actually conclude at this point that the diet can be our medicine if we take care of it. But if we don't treat it in a proper way or take care of it, then it could also take a disadvantage to our health, right?
Definitely, yeah, definitely. Though I'm very much against kind of making a religion out of the food you're eating. Yeah. I think that's getting more and more common in our society, actually. So the most important thing I would say, and the advice that I typically give, even if I'm not a nutritional expert, but it's just having a balanced diet, and that typically avoids most of the critical food contaminant maximum levels that would be really problematic from a health perspective. So if you have a balanced diet, that's probably the best thing you can do.
So when we put now another layer in this topic, how do environmental factors such as pollution or climate change influence the exposome and ultimately our health?
Well, we're living in an environment that is changing, and there are many ways that food contaminants or environmental exposures can impact our health. So all modes of toxicological action you could think about, from carcinogenicity to toxic effects on any of your organs. Your metabolism can be changed. It can even affect the way that drugs, so pharmaceutical drugs, are effective or not effective in your body. It's summarized by this idea of drug exposome interactions, a completely new field where we found some compelling first insights that this could be a reason why certain medicines are maybe working for you, David, but not for me, or why I do suffer more significant side effects. So there are many, many different ways, and I'm sure we have not uncovered all of them yet.
And can you maybe provide an example of how specific environmental exposures have been linked to health outcomes?
Well, there are many specific examples, and this is what research did over the last decades in a very good way, looking at individual toxins, contaminants, or classes of contaminants, and did exposure assessment, toxicological assessment, and then ultimately evaluated the risk. So in the area of food safety, natural toxins, of course, the aflatoxins would be very prominent for liver cancer that was found in the late 1980s in sub-Saharan Africa. And actually Chris Wilde, the molecular epidemiologist from the United Kingdom who led these efforts back then, he was the one who later became the director of the International Agency for Research on Cancer, the WHO, and he was the first one to propose this exposome concept. And this podcast will be streamed in January 2025, if I'm right.
Yes.
And this marks exactly the 20-year anniversary when Chris Wilde first proposed this concept to not look at individual factors and individual contaminant classes or contaminants, but at the combined exposure. But coming back to your question on those individual factors, so the aflatoxins are one example. Another one that's very much in the media and public attention right now are the PFAS, the poly and perfluorinated alkylated chemicals, also known under the term forever chemicals, which are anywhere in our environment, in our bodies. We find it in all our samples, basically. It's not a problem anymore analytically. And they have been linked to several health conditions like changes in cholesterol levels that will affect ultimately your cardiovascular disease risk. They have been linked to immune responses and so on. And there are many examples for basically all contaminants. The important thing from my perspective is that we need a paradigm change, not looking at the individual contaminants, but looking at them in a combined way on one hand. And on the other hand, also to take into account low-dose chronic exposures, because in the past, typically animal experiments were used to determine the toxicological mode of action, and that's not a real-life scenario. So you and me, we are exposed to low levels of mycotoxins, of PFAS chemicals, and so on. And what they're doing in the long term, after you've been exposed for 20, 30, 40 years, that's the real question we need to address in future research.
So you have already mentioned it, chronic diseases is one of the focal points in your work, right? So how does the exposome contribute to the development of chronic diseases like cancer or cardiovascular disease?
Yeah, that's the big question actually. And we are just trying to start to understand how this all works together, and it's extremely complex. Even for some of these very strong carcinogenic compounds like aflatoxin B1, it took a long time to find out the mode of action and really get hard epidemiological evidence that it's responsible for liver cancer, that there are synergistic effects together with hepatitis virus and other factors and so on. So even for these very strong bad actors, it was difficult. So it's even more critical if we want to look at the combined exposures that we are chronically exposed to basically from the time we are in the womb of our mothers. So this early life exposure is an important thing. So one example maybe I can address this question is one of the most severe diseases troubling the women in our society, breast cancer. It's still the most frequent cancer in women globally and especially in the westernized world. And it's not one disease, actually. There are many different kinds of breast cancer. So, but for simplicity, I will just call it like that. And we know that there are many different risk factors. So, you know, if you are obese, that's a risk factor. There are some genetic predispositions for especially triple negative breast cancer. But I'm talking more about now this post-menopausal breast cancer that will affect 1 in 8 women of our generation, just because we are living longer and the risk factors are not declining actually. So we know some of these very well-known factors as known, adipositas, smoking, alcohol drinking, all these things that are basically bad for you and will impact any kind of cancer or chronic condition. Right. But in the case of breast cancer, where the hormonal status of a woman is very important, we know that through our environment and the food we expose to a multitude of different so-called endocrine disrupting chemicals. So chemicals that can impact our hormonal balance, our endogenous human-made hormones, that would be mostly estrogens. In the case of women, for us men, it's more testosterone. Though even we have estrogens in our blood, right? So, but at a low level, of course. And the question is now, if we want to really find hard evidence that endocrine disrupting chemicals are linked to breast cancer, it's not enough to look at 1 or 2 of them. So like these perfluorinated substances, they also have endocrine disrupting properties. They somehow have probably been linked to breast cancer as well in some studies, but you will never find hard evidence if you're only looking at this one class of compounds and not looking at others. Other classes would include some, let's continue with the mycotoxins. We have some of the strongest endocrine disrupting chemicals are natural contaminants like cerealenone that can even be activated in our liver actually to get even more estrogenic, but it's completely neglected by most people in the risk assessment area because it's a natural toxin that has been there for thousands of years and it's not a man-made chemical like the PFAS or the bisphenols or phthalates. So those would be plastics associated chemicals that also act on our hormonal balance that somehow have been linked to hormonal cancers like breast cancer, for example. So the challenge is really to look at all these things together and kind of get a total endocrine disrupting chemical count, so to say, and then link this to disease risk. And this is just one example for one disease.
And is there a certain threshold of exposure that leads to the disease, or is it the cumulative effect over time that's more significant? I mean, when you already mentioned zearalenone, for example, maybe in combination with other phytoestrogens like genistein or something like that. Right. Is this the point at the end? Or?
Well, that's a very good question, and I have to say I have no answer for that, and no one will be able to honestly answer that because we just don't know, and that's actually a very hot topic in the research arena right now. Is there any kind of exposure level that can be assumed to be safe? The answer is we don't know. Probably for many things there is, and I'm very much against being too alarmistic. So sometimes people ask me, now that we are able to analyze hundreds and thousands of those chemicals in basically any sample, if I'm still eating something, if I'm afraid that my kids are exposed to all that stuff, and I typically tell them they should relax, and probably 99% of those chemicals do not pose any risk. Our human body is very good in detoxifying. Our liver is an awesome organ with great capacity, actually. But the important thing is to find out those, maybe it's 1% of the chemicals, maybe it's 0.1%, no one knows, that really do have an effect on the chronic conditions. So, and then also find out, is there a certain safe threshold for a compound alone, or as you mentioned, these mixture effects actually, or cocktail effects are a very, it's also a very, very, very important topic in toxicology and in this risk assessment right now, because we are just starting to understand how molecules interact with each other. And you mentioned zearalenone, so some of my colleagues at the University of Vienna that are true toxicologists, so not like me, analytical guys, going a bit into that direction, but they did great in vitro work and could show that zearalenone acts synergistic with many of those phytoestrogens or bisphenols and basically other kinds of endocrine disrupting chemicals. And that must not mean that it's the same or that it's also true in our human body. This was in cell models, which is a very good first step, but really going to the human body and understanding what this means in large-scale epidemiological studies has not been done mostly so far, and will be the big challenge of the next decades to come.
And I think it also highlights the importance of this interdisciplinary character this kind of research belongs to. And I want to shift gears now and have a special question now for you. I want to talk a little bit about social inequality, which has also been linked to environmental exposure. Could you tell us more about how the exposome plays a role in social disparities in health?
Yeah, that's thanks for the question. It's also a good one, and of course we are not living in a just world, and it's a big problem. So I want to answer that question in two ways. First, on a global scale, and then on a more local or regional one. And I have to say, I'm not an expert in this. In these social equality topics, besides being a normal citizen and having my personal opinion on that. But when we are looking at it from a global perspective, we know very clearly that there are great differences. And for example, I mentioned before the work of Chris Wilde with the aflatoxins, that in some regions of the world, food safety standards are completely different than in Austria or Europe or the westernized or the economically more privileged world. Let's put it that way, and that has, of course, a huge impact on the chemical exposome and also on the social exposome that those communities are facing. And that's something we should address, because after all, we are on one earth, and I think people are starting to understand, especially with chemical pollution. If we are shifting away from, let's say, putting the dirty industry from Europe to Asia or Africa, they will not solve our problem in the long term, because most of the chemicals, we've seen that in a very dramatic way for these PFAS, for the forever chemicals, that we can find them everywhere now because they are mobile, they are traveling, they are persistent. So shifting problems is not a real option if we want to have sustainable solutions. And I think we are more and more understanding that. And from that perspective, this global thinking is very important, even if it's often not implemented in the policies we're having. Of course, the policymakers always need to protect their own population, whether it's in Austria or in Europe, and that's good. That's their mandate. That's clear. But I think we need to think more on a global perspective here. And we see this in all the health statistics, and I think that's a direct impact of the exposome. When we are looking at a more local level, here in our very rich Western world, we also see differences. Of course, that if you are economically more privileged, you would typically have more options in buying more healthy, more diverse food, at least in theory and in average. And this could also lead, of course, to different exposure patterns. So we know if you're richer, typically you're buying more organic food, and thereby you would probably have lower levels of pesticides, which is positive. What most people do not think about is that if you're not using, let's say, herbicides, so pesticides that are killing weeds on the field, you might end up in having natural plant toxins in your food. So maybe those people are then less privileged when it comes to some of these natural toxins, or if you don't apply fungicides, you might end up in having higher mycotoxin concentrations in your food. So this is an ongoing discussion, and maybe I'm not up to date, but from my perspective, there's still no clear answer how this plays out. And actually also because we mentioned the PFAS chemicals before, there are studies that are showing that the higher the income, the higher the level of PFAS. So it's linked to income, it's linked to educational status, and it's linked also to some extent to IQ values, which is somehow strange. But probably it's just because if you can afford more, you have more of this high-end clothing, maybe where in the past more PFAS was used, like Gore-Tex and so on. But this is a bit elusive, so I don't want to go too much into that. But just to give you some hints on how this can play out and what we need to think about. From my perspective, there are no clear answers yet. It's something we need to take into account, to discuss in the future, to also implement in our health system. I think that's probably one of the driving forces why we're doing this research, because we really need to be more proactive in this whole field of looking at contaminants, at exposures, at environmental pollution, and get away from this passive acting initiative that we are finding a bad actor that was in the environment for decades, and now we're finding out it's detrimental to our health. We need to be more proactive. And actually the Green Deal in the European Union now is going more into that direction, that chemicals may only be released to consumers, to the environment, if they have been proven safe before. So I think there are good policy changes in that direction, but we need to be more proactive and more in the driving seat and have this prevention concept in mind. So I think prevention health is extremely important and completely underdeveloped, even in Austria, where we are spending billions each year on the public health system. It's still much better than people think, I guess, personally. But we are paying less than 2% in prevention, actually. So it's a big tragedy, I think, and it needs to change. And I think the exposome will be one of the game changers that can make people understand why it's important to do good lifestyle choices if you want to be healthy after retirement. If there will be something like that for us, let's see. We're still quite young, so
let's see.
But there will be many interesting things happening till then, I expect.
Yeah, thank you for your insights on this topic, and I think we can see how complex this topic is in general, and that there is still a lot of improvement. But I think very important take-home messages is that we have to do more on the preventive and the proactivity side. Benedikt, you know that this podcast is called Analytically Delicious. So that means we will also talk a little bit about the analytics behind the story we talk here. So with the rapid advancements of analytical technologies in recent years, how are mass spectrometry and metabolomics being used to study the exposome in a more integrated way?
Yeah, thank you. So that's actually a really great question, and I think it gives a lot of hope. So many people think this area of contaminants and toxins is a very, very, very depressing field, but I think actually it's very fascinating, and we've been exposed to most of the stuff for a long time, for some of the natural toxins since humans exist, basically, and now we are, because of modern analytical instrumentation and analytical chemists making them work in a proper way, able to actually see those exposures even at very, very low levels. And I think that's really nice because we can do informed decisions. And I was lucky enough to see that firsthand. So I started actually my PhD, was it like 15 years ago? Yeah. So right at the edge when the first very sensitive triple mass specs were on the market, that really enabled also this human biomonitoring. So meaning measuring the contaminants and toxins and their metabolites, not only in food or in environmental samples, after you're doing all this enrichment and very tedious sample preparation techniques that I did myself in an environmental lab while I was a student. I had to work, and I did some of these measurements where you needed to have 1 liter of sample to actually get one analytical result, which seems ridiculous when I'm thinking back now. So now we are using like 20 microliters and measuring hundreds of analytes at completely different level. And this is because the instrumentation got much more sensitive, much more specific. We can use high resolution mass spectrometers. So we're using Orbitrap technology, we're using time of flight technology in our lab from multiple vendors. And each of these instruments has its advantages and disadvantages. So they're still difficult to handle at high performance, I have to say. That's why you need a very specialized team. And for all the people maybe listening and considering where their career should go, I think mass spec is really a very good field that will continue to expand in the future, because you can just do so much things in a very effective way that were not possible before, not only in the food analytics area or in the environmental area, but also in the clinics, in the governmental sectors, basically everywhere. So it opens up for completely new opportunities, but also challenges. So treating all that data and making sense out of it, actually that's the real challenge now, not the measurement itself, but doing that kind of work.
And can you maybe share a recent example where new technologies have provided insights into how environmental factors affect human health?
Yeah, well, so I would like to go back to the one example that I mentioned on breast cancer and the endocrine disrupting chemicals, because that's something we invested a lot of time, money and love during the last 7 years, where I built up my own lab. And we started off with the hypothesis that we wanted to measure all these endocrine disrupting chemicals, or many of them, that are feasible to measure on LCMS, so coupling liquid chromatography with a triple quadruple mass spectrometer by electrospray ionization. We wanted to measure them together as a kind of total endocrine disrupting chemical count, but we also wanted to take into account the endogenous estrogens. So all these estradiol, estriol, and so on. So all these natural hormones that mostly women have in their circulation, and all their metabolites, actually, because we know that the metabolism of those human hormones can impact cancer risk as well. That's known. And they're circulating also at very low levels in the blood, actually. So typically low ppb, part per billion or part per trillion levels. So very difficult analytical challenge, actually. And we started off by building these methods where we first could measure like 50, 60 of those endocrine disrupting and endogenous hormones together. And now we just finished the validation of a method where we can measure more than 200 of those compounds in a quantitative way, extremely sensitive, partially in the part per trillion range. Okay. So meaning that, and that's in human plasma or serum samples, but also in urine or breast milk. So that means part per trillion. If one molecule out of a trillion molecules in this sample, in a very low volume sample, could be only 50 or 100 microliters. So some drops of blood, basically. We can measure one of those molecules. If it's bisphenol A, whether it's one of the PFAS, whether it's an estrogenic mycotoxin, if it's an industrial chemical, if it's a personal care product that comes maybe from sunscreen or whatever. And I think that's very fascinating. And to go even beyond that, because you asked me about the innovation, we can not only measure those 200 compounds in a targeted quantitative manner, but we can also, by new methods, combine these targeted measurements where we know exactly what we want to measure, where we have analytical standards, internal standards, quantitative data. We can combine that with the so-called non-targeted analysis, where we are basically measuring all the ions and the metabolic features that we can ionize in a sample. Those could be a couple of thousands, maybe tens of thousands in your sample. And we don't know what is the identity, what's the molecule behind the signal. And that's very important because we can use this to measure, on one hand, our human endogenous molecules, so not only hormones, but also, let's say, the basic biochemistry of our body, to see how chemical exposures that we would measure, how these impact our human metabolism and our basic biochemistry. So we do not measure only the exposure, but also the effect. And we can do all of this in one injection of a very low volume sample. And I think that's absolutely fascinating. And that's a new method we just published some months ago to combining this targeted and non-targeted. So that's, I'm really fascinated that we can do this now.
It is really fascinating, and I always bring the example of measuring one specific sand grain in the desert of Sahara. So if you want to compare, for the listeners out there who are not familiar with the analytical stuff we are.
But what would that be, like one sand kernel in the whole Sahara?
Oh, we had to
part per trillion or even below that?
I think below that,
Wow, yeah.
But it shows us how sensitive the instrumentations are nowadays, and also the technical improvements of the last decades.
It is, and one thing I maybe want to add here, because many people ask me, okay, now you can measure all that stuff, you're an analytical guy, so you're just doing it because you can do it, but there is no impact on health, on policy, whatever. So why you always want to go lower with your detection limits? And I have to say, I partially have to agree with that argument. So probably for many of the things we are measuring, we would not need to be so sensitive, and I absolutely agree. But on the other hand, there might be some of those really bad actors that we maybe don't know yet, or maybe we know them, but we do not know that there are synergistic toxicological effects that make the potency of a certain low abundance molecule much more relevant. And as mentioned before, if there's 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000 or even 1 in 10,000 of those molecules, it's worth finding out this one molecule and kind of getting rid of it. Thinking again about the aflatoxin, if you could only reduce that on a global scale, it would have a tremendous health impact. And that's like 40, 50 years after we know how bad it is. We still could not solve the bigger problem at the global scale. Although we know. So I think that's a real reason why we still should focus on getting more sensitive, getting more holistic in the measurements, but still explaining that just that we can find a substance, let's say in your drinking water or in your foodstuff, does not mean you should not eat it or you will die the next day. So that's very important to be not alarmistic, but just use this information to do informed, good decisions.
Yeah, very important point. And Benedikt, we are now already talking since more than half an hour about the exposome and about all these external environmental factors influencing our health. And it leads a little bit to I would say, negatively connotated term of the exposome. So that's why I want to ask you, can you speak to the idea of a healthy exposome? Is there such a thing, or is the exposome always linked to health risks?
Well, I have to say, I love this question, and I think you are the first moderator asking about the positive effects. Yeah. And I'm also seeing this from the point that in Europe, sometimes we're maybe a bit more pessimistic. And also this term exposome comes from exposure. Mm-hmm. And we are German speaking, right? So in German, there is no real translation for that. Mm-hmm. People would think maybe about term Belastung, which is very negatively connotated. Yeah. It's always something negative. So I agree. And typically when I'm talking here in the German-speaking countries about that, I'm saying that exposure can also be something good. So I'm now having exposure to you, to this podcast, to this nice environment here, and I'm really enjoying it. So it's positive exposure, actually. And also, if you would go to America, to the States, they would also not have this negative connotation. So very good question. And to answer it, yes, there is clearly something like healthy factors in your exposome, and actually also in our diet. We would starve and die if we would not have diet. So the vast share of all the molecules in there are essential for our life and are very positive. And we must not forget that while talking about the toxic components that are in the minority. And actually there are also small molecules that can have beneficial effects. So one example here would be, for example, the polyphenols that are long known for positive health effects, reducing certain risks for chronic disease, the Mediterranean diet and all these things flowing around in our heads. So you should eat a lot of vegetables and fruits and drink wine because of the polyphenols. I would doubt that. So I think the ethanol in the wine is toxicologically very problematic, and there is no safe level for ethanol. So I think that's not state of the art anymore, that there is any level of alcohol that's really, really safe.
That's the French paradoxon. But
Right, yeah. But it's only part of it. And actually, I think the reason why this cannot be really explained or repeated in many cases is because they are not looking at the totality of stuff. So for the polyphenols, for example, we developed methods where we can measure up to 100 of those polyphenols together and do not only focus on the resveratrol, which is kind of the most famous polyphenol where many nutritional studies have been done, but focusing only on one substance and neglecting that we measured hundreds, but there are thousands of polyphenols out there. And if you eat only one apple, you're exposed probably to hundreds of them. And there are more to be discovered in the future, just depending on how sensitive we measure actually. And we develop tools in the non-targeted arena to find new polyphenols and stuff like that. But it would be too much for now, I guess. But yeah, there are healthy exposures, and we're even thinking in the direction that it would be good, thinking at it from a prevention perspective, if we find out certain individuals, let's say, that have a genetic predisposition for a certain disease, or that are living in an area where you have certain exposures in your drinking water just because of the geology of the soil, or you have certain contaminants in the cereals just because of climatic conditions and so on. I think it makes sense to think about how you could kind of counteract negative actors by positive exposures, like polyphenols. So that's something we do not understand very holistically right now. I think that will be important in the future. And it's also important to get away from this classical black and white thinking, like polyphenols are good and other pollutants are bad. Of course, pollutants are bad, but polyphenols can also have maybe negative effects during some seasons of your life. So we could show that, for example, during my postdoctoral work, where we looked at a new breast cancer combination therapy. And we found out that not only some classical food contaminants, but also positively associated polyphenols like genistein could impact the effect of a breast cancer treatment and kind of negate the positive effect of the treatment in a cell model. And this was, again, not proven in humans. It's too early to have any conclusions here. but it shows that these exposure dynamics are important. When does a certain exposure occur? Is it in early life, during pregnancy, during the first days of life? Is it during puberty when a lot is going on with your hormonal balances? Is it in the elderly, maybe when the immune response is already somehow suppressed? Or is it in hopefully healthy middle-aged individuals like us, where we have kind of full detoxification capacity of our liver in the ideal case and so on? So we need to take that into account, and that makes the stuff even more complicated. So listeners might be a bit frustrated, but I think it's fascinating, and it shows us where we can go in the future, and that there are actually many things that we can proactively and positively impact. And I think that's the message we need to get along. We have great analytical instrumentation and technology nowadays. We're understanding more about the chronic health implications, and we need to use it in a proactive way at every level, from policy to personal lifestyle and industrial changes, how we can use that for the good, again, at the population level, thinking about population prevention, but also at the individual level. And I think that's a great message we can share.
Definitely, yeah. So, Benedikt, we are already coming to an end of this episode, and you mentioned already a couple of times the term future. And given your expertise in exposomics, what is the future of this research, and how might it impact public health policy or food safety standards in the coming years?
Right. Yes, I think going into prevention is the way we cannot neglect any longer. Again, at population and at personal level, within Europe, but also globally. And this personal health incentives are probably also something that can really, or hopefully can change personal behavior for the good. What I also see as a very important thing in the future, and where this field of exposome research and exposomics is doing a very good job from my perspective, is to link the different disciplines. And you mentioned that actually before. We then switched the topic, but I want to briefly come back to you, because I think that's actually a real game changer, that in this field now, the food safety guys work together with the analytical chemists, with the environmental engineers and researchers, with the toxicologists, with the people in metabolomics, with the people that are in epidemiology, with clinical researchers, with policymakers, and just bring these people at the table and trying to solve the issues together is a complex endeavor, I have to say. And I'm guilty that myself, I have to say. So I mentioned before that I started my PhD like 15 years ago in the area of food safety. And I think we did a great job actually back then, and I had awesome supervisors. But looking back, there would have been many things that we could have learned from the environmental sciences, for example. But there was just no way of real interaction when you're going to scientific conferences, or the journals you're publishing in are typically very separated from the food safety field, the environmental field, the epidemiology, and so on. And bringing this together, I think that's one of the things that the exposome field can do. And we are doing it already here in Austria. At the national level, we are actually doing an initiative, and I'm lucky enough to coordinate that, called Exposome Austria. That's a research infrastructure where we want to bring this top-notch analytical mass spec technologies, but also the bioinformatics data processing, and then the implementation into epidemiology and the clinics, where we bring that together. And we see that at this level, we are already cooperating greatly with people from the medical universities, from the different disciplines, from the Environment Agency, from other policymakers, and so on. And this is really very fruitful for all of us. And I don't know, am I allowed to do a short commercial?
Of course.
Yeah. So if you're in Austria, we will do next year in September on the 23rd an open event where we're trying to bring together all the people that are interested in some of these aspects that are covered by exposome research. And we just announced that a couple of days ago. So you should find the information online if you're looking for the Exposome Austria Days. And within this national initiative, we are embedded in a European initiative, which is called IRENE. That's the Environmental and Exposure Research Assessment Platform at the European level, where we're trying to harmonize the technology to really get comparable, high-quality data sets that can do large-scale epidemiological studies in the future, because no one can do it alone, and we need some degree of harmonization. And to go even beyond that, we are also connecting this European initiative to a global initiative. So we just had leading administrators from the National Institutes of Health in America here at our university to link them to our national and European initiatives, because we all see this need for setting global standards and addressing these issues together. And I think that's very positive news. And I can only invite everyone interested in this area and working in any field that's somehow linked, and basically that's nearly everything, to connect, because this integrated mindset is something that we need and that we're also trying to foster within our students. So I'm teaching undergrad chemistry students, and I think we can solve the issues by teaching them early on in toxicology, in this integrated thinking, that there is not one crisis, one thing we need to address, but multiple things. So like the triple crisis, there is not only climate change, there is also environmental and chemical pollution that needs to be thought together, and biodiversity loss. So you cannot look at that individually. Well, you can, and that's what's happening right now, I think. But I don't want to go into politics. I want to stay in science, and there it's important to teach people that we need a generation of new scientists having this integrated thinking to solve issues together in an integrated manner.
Perfect last words of this episode, I would say. And thank you very much for organizing this conference. I'm really looking forward also to participate in it next year.
Glad to hear.
And I think today we have uncovered how environmental exposures, especially from the food we eat, play a really crucial role in shaping our health and contributing to the development of chronic diseases, right? So if there's one takeaway from this discussion today, I would say that the exposome isn't just about the risks. It's a tool for understanding how we can create healthier environments for future generations. And therefore, thank you very much, Benedikt, for sharing your expertise and the insights into this fascinating world of the exposome. It was a great pleasure talking to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you also for summarizing it in that nice way. And I hope that I can quote you in the future. It's beautiful. Thank you, David.
Thank you.
If you found today's conversation as enlightening as we did and want to stay informed about future episodes, remember to subscribe to our podcast on Spotify or YouTube. By subscribing, you'll never miss a bite of our delicious insights into food safety and analysis. And for those of you with burning questions or lingering curiosities related to our today's episode or any other food safety topic, don't hesitate to contact service at lva.at. Your questions will be addressed either directly in our next episode or by our team of experts on our website, www.lva.at. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time, stay safe and stay informed.